I appreciate both of those comments very much, and both of those remarks. I was asked to actually talk a little bit about strategy and some of the strategies that we're experimenting with, some of the things that we're seeing that are exciting and are worth looking into and potentially learning from in order to actually build power. In our view, Jobs for Justice, if we really want to build a new economy, we must directly confront corporate power, white supremacy, and all the systems of capitalism. We don't believe in simply setting up separate systems as if to create kind of a paradise, a safe distance away from everybody else. And for us, collective bargaining at its best is a system by which workers are able to exercise power in a way that directly confronts the owners of capital and in a way that reclaims portions of that capital back to working people in our communities. It has served as a direct mechanism to fight for a fair return on the labor we put into building, operating, servicing, moving things. And so it is this dynamic that traditionally has been a historic source of tension between the movement for collective bargaining and the labor movement and the movement that seeks to build a solidarity economy. But this is a false binary. And the cooperative movement and the movement to expand collective bargaining are not on opposite ends of the battle to build a society that works for everyone. We ultimately want the same thing for workers to have more power, more control over their labor power, more control over their working conditions and their communities. And we ultimately share in the desire for workers to benefit fairly from the fruits of their labor, from each according to their ability, to each according to its need. And in the process, to expand transparency and participation from all stakeholders, most importantly, those operating the enterprise, the workers. But in order to make the real case for any of that, I want to just discuss a little bit the history of it, and then I have a couple of examples that I'll share. So, because I feel like we just have to have a clear background of our shared experience, and also where things have gone hideously awry in the U.S. We learn more from our mistakes than from our successes sometimes. And then we'll come back to some of the examples. So first, I just want to make sure we're clear on the same page of even the idea of the corporation and how it's evolved in the United States, or I should say devolved in the United States over the past century. Stephen Pearlstein wrote in the American Prospect, and quote, "The earliest corporations, in fact, were generally chartered not for private but for public purposes, such as building canals or transit systems. Well into the 1960s, corporations were broadly viewed as owing something in return to the community that provided them with the special legal protections and the economic ecosystem in which they could grow and thrive." End quote. So the earliest corporations in the United States depended on stakeholders, which included workers and the surrounding community, or the human capital, first and foremost, over the idea of prioritizing the needs of shareholders. In fact, there is no historical or legal mandate that corporations must prioritize profits for shareholders, right, over the human and social needs of stakeholders. There's no historical or legal mandate for that. But of course, globalization and deregulation incentivized the shareholder-centered approach, and companies spouting all that socialist jazz were eaten up by the market. It is in this environment that unions in the U.S. have relied on National Labor Relations Board elections to get to the bargaining table, even though that has never actually blazed the strongest path to negotiations. Even in the heyday of the National Labor Relations Act, government statistics in 1937 showed that while only 262,000 workers won union recognition through the electoral process sanctioned by that act, over 700,000 workers won union recognition by striking. Direct action always won more. So the big question of the past century, and the big question we still face today, is they're asking me to slow down. I'm going to try to speak as slow as I possibly can. I'm from North Carolina, right? But I got 7 minutes to fit all this in, so I'm going to do my best, so bear with me. So the big questions of the past century, right, and the big questions of today, the consequences of which continue to negatively impact us, are who workers can bargain with and what workers can bargain over. So in other words, what are the boundaries of worker power and control over the companies they work for, or control over our economy? Like, what are the actual boundaries of our power? Ideally, just like those of you in the cooperative movement seek to equalize ownership, control, and decisions over a company's model, practices, and distribution of revenue, union workers also sought to have a say over their business practices. And in fact, in the early days of some of the sharpest battles, in fact, in 1945, in the General Motors strike, some of you may remember this, at least the story, or reading about it, where Walter Reuther and the auto workers said that they wanted a raise, but without raising prices. That they wanted to be able to buy the cars that they created, and they wanted the community to be able to purchase the things that they were manufacturing. And this was a very sharp moment, and Mitt Romney's father, of course, was a part of squashing it. But the long and short is that this actually became the paradigm after World War II, that workers could only negotiate over this very narrow practice of wages and worksite things. Workers were no longer able to, through their unions, negotiate for broader community interests beyond what was directly in front of them about wages. Because the UAW ultimately accepted a contract that was just about wages, right? And this trend in bargaining persists today. So while many workers in other countries, like in Germany and South Africa and various countries in South America, have a role in governing a company's business model and business practices, in addition to negotiating a fair wage, American unions have long been squeezed into this very narrow bargaining position. At the same time, historically, workers reached another crossroad that negatively impacts us today, and for different reasons that I won't claim to have full expertise on. The collective bargaining agreements we were able to win, or the employment contract, as we call it today, started to include things that would have been better placed in a broad social contract or government programs accessible for everyone. These include health care, pensions, retirement security, you name it. And it's been said that that actually has not only undermined our ability to win these big things from the government for everyone to actually have, but has actually incentivized companies in the U.S. and corporations in the U.S. in fighting against unions more aggressively than they would in other places. So I share this because I don't think all is lost. I share this because we need to understand the historic context of the fight for collective bargaining in the U.S. And I actually think that the position that we're in today, where companies are even fighting against that narrow bargaining position, actually creates some huge opportunities for us. And I couldn't leave you today without sharing some examples of those opportunities, especially after just the last couple of months, where 45,000 Verizon workers were actually able to go on strike for over a month to win a contract, a first contract for some Verizon wireless workers. Right. So if anything, these setbacks have actually generated a more robust climate for organizing and experimenting with a new paradigm for collective bargaining in the U.S. So first example, in Brooklyn, the Crown Heights Tenants Union is combining the efforts. It's Crown Heights, some people are part of the Crown Heights Tenants Union? That's awesome, I didn't even know. Holla back. All right, so they're combining efforts with some of the building staff of these large apartment buildings to actually confront the owners of these large apartment buildings over conditions and wages and rents. And together, they'll be able to win some kind of agreement. I think for the workers, it would be some kind of collective bargaining agreement. For the tenants, it would be another kind of agreement. But both would be binding, and both would be able to expand what's possible in that industry and could lead to a completely different level of participation and decision-making and create a new paradigm for negotiating in the largest real estate industry in the country. The Restaurant Opportunity Center, or ROC United, which some of you may be familiar with, is exploring how to increase worker organization and participation where they have members by engaging some of the underpublicized laws in states like California and Maine that require workers to vote on how tips are distributed. Each year, they have to vote on how tips are distributed, which is not often happening, and certainly the restaurant owners aren't sharing that, right? But this seemingly small approach will actually allow them to build membership of restaurant workers and slowly expand what workers are collectively making decisions on. They're starting small, they're starting where they're at, but if they're successful, it's something that could be replicable to scale in restaurants around the country and build worker power and worker participation in a very different way. In 2012 contract negotiations, the Chicago Teachers Union went beyond wages for teachers and fought to improve education for over 400,000 students through increased funding, stronger curricula, support systems for parents, right? And the union bargained for what they called the common good, going beyond the traditional scope of workplace bargaining, but expanding it to broader community conditions. They didn't wait for the law to tell them they could or couldn't do it. They just did it. And they forced the question with Mayor Rahm Emanuel, went on strike, and won. And then lastly, this question Makani brought up in her opening around this new economy versus the old economy. We have to be careful with this because our opponents use new economy to undermine our ability to bargain and negotiate with them. To our opponents, the new economy is the gig economy, it's the Ubers, it's the Lyfts, it's the Airbnbs. It's these entities that actually undermine workers' ability to organize in hospitality and transportation and taxi driving and whatnot. But there are models that are beginning to combat this as well. I mean, in New York, of course, there are folks who are trying to actually organize those workers as workers, not as independent contractors, to be able to negotiate and bargain directly with Uber. In Seattle, however, they say, okay, fine. You want to call them independent employers, you want to call them independent contractors? Well, let's create an entirely new set of laws that allow them to negotiate with the parent company, with Uber, collectively. They can be both owners of their cars and workers who can negotiate with the company. And those may seem contradictory overall, but at this point, we're in a climate where we have to actually try and experiment with anything to see whether it's on the municipal level, on the state level, or the federal level to change the paradigm in which workers are able to negotiate and bargain. So I have other examples. I can't give them all here because we have such limited time, but I do want to share just one of the best-known examples that I think folks here would be familiar with, which is the Mondragon Cooperative in Spain and in the Basque Country, which is a huge example of both the relationship, and an exciting example of the relationship between workers and collective bargaining and cooperative worker ownership. And there are a lot of parallels within the structure between Mondragon's experience and what we're able to do here within the union experience, even within the narrow collective bargaining paradigm we have in the US. For example, in Mondragon, you have a General Assembly, which consists of all worker owners, which is similar to a union convention. You have a social council, which is essentially a bargaining unit representing workers as a whole internally to the management council. Whereas in the US, this would be an adversarial relationship between managers and workers. Because in Mondragon, because the need to maximize profits for the CEOs of the executives is not there, because it's a worker ownership cooperative, right? That's actually more of an opportunity for them to then jointly tweak and improve the practices of the company overall, right? And so even though they started in this very small region of the Basque Country in Spain, they grew international to be all over the world, to employ 75,000 worker owners, right? They actually built a cooperative model to scale, and a model where workers have power in negotiating the decisions of a business model, right? So I just want to share a little bit there. I mean, I'll stop there, but I just want to bring home the nugget that, number one, our movements are not at odds, and two, it's very key in this particular moment, not just to say there are these big opportunities, there definitely are, but that all we have to do is start where we are, in the one restaurant where we're based, in the one neighborhood where we know people who are driving for Uber or for Lyft, in the one town, in the one city, and then to build replicable models that we can build up to scale. That's how we're actually going to change the bargaining paradigm in this country, and that's how we're going to build worker power.